Hello and welcome to this broadcast by Brexit Watch. I'm your host, Jonathan Saxty. Today we are delighted to welcome the British statesman and former Conservative Party leader, Lord Michael Howard. After a distinguished career at the bar, Lord Howard served as an MP between 1983 and 2010. During that time, he was Secretary of State for Employment, Secretary of State for the Environment, Home Secretary and Leader of the Opposition. Lord Howard, welcome to Brexit Watch.
Thank you very much, Jonathan.
Now, Michael, before we get into the nuts and bolts of our discussion, I'd like to wish you and your family well during this unprecedented crisis. Can I begin by asking how the coronavirus crisis has personally impacted you and your work over the last few months?
Well, not a great deal, to be honest. The work that I do, I've been able to do remotely. I've been much more fortunate than very many people who've suffered so much hardship in so many different ways.
And sticking with the coronavirus crisis, Michael, what would be your overall assessment so far of how the government has handled it compared to other countries in the Western world?
I think that any judgment on the way in which the government has conducted affairs has to take into account the incredibly difficult challenges that they faced. This is a completely unprecedented situation. It's a new virus. Not much is known about it even now. Not surprisingly, even the scientists and the medics don't know for sure what the right thing to do is. Given all those immense difficulties, I think the government has performed pretty well. Now, of course, in time, when we look back on everything with the benefit of hindsight, I'm quite sure that people will find things that might have been done better. But that's with the benefit of hindsight. And if you think about these very difficult challenges, my assessment, for what it's worth, is that the government has done pretty well.
And that includes the policies undertaken by the Chancellor?
Oh, definitely. Well, I think the policies undertaken by the Chancellor have been a great success. I shudder to think where we'd be without them. And he took action decisively, and I think that the actions he has taken have been profoundly helpful.
Now, sticking with the economic side of the crisis, Michael, we've obviously now we're talking about coming out of the lockdown to some extent, some easing. We've already seen this take place in Europe. What do you think in the medium term some of the economic consequences of the crisis are going to be for the UK economy?
Well, you're asking me to make predictions, and they're very difficult to make. It was, I think it was the distinguished American economist J.K. Galbraith who said that economic forecasting was only invented to make astrology look respectable. So I'm not in a position to make any forecasts. I hope that the recovery will be soon and will be strong. And there are some grounds for optimism. There are other grounds for pessimism. That's my hope. I can't go beyond that.
I mean, obviously, the world economy is a sort of interconnected spider's web. I've spoken with people and made the point that, you know, even if a country like New Zealand, if you like, comes back online, as it were, it's not until its trading partners, its other trading partners come back online as well, that its economy, you know, sort of gets back to full throttle. So on the geopolitical side, what do you think some of the economic consequences are there?
Well, that's a very, very big question, because all sorts of things have happened on what you describe as the geopolitical side, not all of them directly related to the virus. But the basic point you make is absolutely right. We are still part of a global economy and a globalized economy. And although I think there is going to be a rebalancing, and I think there will be more emphasis on self-sufficiency in the new normal when we get to it, we will still be part of a globalized economy, and our economic future will, to some extent, always depend on what's happening in the rest of the world.
Mm. I mean, sticking with the idea of the new normal, there's been a lot of calls internationally for a reset between China and the Western world. There have been calls to hold that country to account. Obviously, there have also been statements along the lines that the West has become dangerously over-dependent on China economically. We could think of some of the PPE shortages and other medical shortages. What do you think? I know you're wary of making economic forecasts, but do you think we are due for some kind of political and economic reset between the Western world and China?
Well, there are several aspects of that. First of all, I think there will be, as I've just said, more emphasis on self-sufficiency. And so I think that particularly when it comes to essential medical products and things like that, I think countries will be looking to build up their domestic capability to a much greater extent than has been the case in the past. But I think it's very important that we shouldn't allow that to tip over into protectionism. Protectionism was what caused so much economic damage in the 1930s, and I think it's very important that we avoid any repeat of that. As far as China is concerned, we don't like many of the things that are happening in China, and we don't like many of the things that China is doing, and Hong Kong is an obvious example. But I don't think it's impossible to ignore China or the part which it plays in the world economy. My watchword would be engage with China, but don't trust it. I don't think it can be trusted, but it's a very important part of the world economy, and we have to engage with it. I think there's a difference between the two.
I mean, what may be some of the the UK obviously has possibly the best higher education system in the world outside the United States. Perhaps that's something which can be utilized to a greater degree after the crisis. For the first time in a long time, perhaps we have the technological capabilities to bring industry back. We've obviously seen during this crisis, we have the technological capabilities to work more from home. I mean, if this crisis had happened in the 1990s, before the internet was widely available, work from home would just not been an option even 20 years ago. Do you think there are some positive consequences which could come out of this crisis?
Oh, undoubtedly. I think there will be more working from home, and I think that will be in many ways a good thing. I think you can exaggerate the extent to which things will change, because I think there are still benefits in the kind of communal effort that happens when people get together in a workplace. But there are many more things which recent experience has demonstrated can be done from home and will be done from home.
Now, leaving the virus side for the time being, let's talk things Brexit. Right now, the UK is in this transition or implementation period that is due to end at the end of this year. During that time, the UK remains in the single market and customs union, but without representation in the European Parliament, still has to make payments into the EU. It's a sort of taxation without representation, due to end in December. Next month will come the deadline for any decision about extending transition. We've obviously had this letter sent by Michel Barnier to UK opposition parties about extending transition. Downing Street has been absolutely adamant that there will be no extension to transition. What's been your reading overall of the negotiations so far, given some of the press reports about disagreements between the EU and the UK?
Well, obviously, the two parties are far apart at the moment, and that's not entirely surprising. We know how the European Union negotiates. It tends to maintain a pretty adamant position right until the very closing stages of the negotiations. and then more common sense prevails, and concessions are made. And I expect the same sort of thing will happen in relation to these negotiations. They're clearly not going very well at the moment, and the two sides are far apart. I've no idea whether it's true that even Mr. Barnier himself believes that the negotiating parameters which he's been set by the European Commission are not really workable. And I think that at some point in the end, both sides are going to have to make concessions, but it won't be. I don't think we'll see them in the next few days.
Now, obviously, Michael, owing to the crisis, there have been calls to extend the transition. People have the argument goes, well, it's been shoulders to the wheel on the crisis, that neither side has had the time nor the resources to really commit to these negotiations, and obviously the negotiations have taken place by video conference. What would you say to those people calling to extend the transition period, sort of kick it into 2021 or 2022? What would you say to them?
I'm not in favor of that. I think there's a danger that this kind of limbo would go on indefinitely. We'd be paying, as you said earlier, it's taxation without representation. And I think deadlines have a powerful impact on negotiations. Deadlines are what actually, when the crunch comes, bring people to the table and get them to make concessions. So I'm not in favor of extending the timetable.
And next month, do you foresee the European Union requesting an extension?
I have no idea whether they will or not, but I don't think it will happen.
No. And obviously the UK side are adamant that it will change nothing. Do you believe that assuming that June deadline comes and goes, that will focus EU minds? Perhaps they're holding out a little bit of hope that there will be some wibbling on the UK side in June.
Possibly, I don't know. It will change to some extent. I wouldn't expect there to be huge progress immediately after the June deadline. But as we get towards the end of the year, I think negotiations will become more meaningful, and I hope that good sense will prevail on both sides, and we'll see concessions on both sides and end up with an agreement which is to our mutual benefit.
And if there is no agreement, Michael, what would you think of trading on WTO terms with the EU going forward?
Well, it's not ideal. It's not the end of the world, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if it looks in December as though agreement is not going to be reached. I would not be at all surprised if a series of ad hoc short-term arrangements were put in place to mitigate any particularly adverse consequences that might follow from a failure to reach agreement. I don't know whether that would happen, but it seemed I wouldn't be surprised if that happened in those circumstances, which I hope won't arise.
Now, in related news, we know that the UK and the United States are engaging in negotiations for a trade deal. UK side led by Elizabeth Truss, US side by Robert Lighthizer. What do you think about that? What are your hopes for a trade deal with the US and, of course, potential trade deals with other countries in the Commonwealth, potentially Japan as well? What are your hopes or thoughts about that?
Well, of course, we want to make trade deals with as many countries across the world as we can. That's one of the benefits of Brexit. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to leave the European Union. We'll be our own master when it comes to trade agreements, and we'll be in a position to make those agreements with other countries. Negotiating trade agreements is never easy. It's always a question of finding the right balance and pros and cons. But I hope that is what will happen.
I mean, there have been rumours or murmurings about the threat to UK agriculture from a US-UK trade deal. Do you think there's any merit to that, or do you think that's scaremongering?
Well, look, it's one of the things that's going to have to be looked at in the context of the agreement. I'm confident that the government is not going to agree to anything that will be seriously damaging to British agriculture. But these are all things that have to be talked about and have to be discussed in the context of the negotiation.
Now, I've discussed with a few people in Australia and Canada about the potential for renewed trade links, potentially security links with those countries. Do you think post-Brexit Britain, with post-Brexit Britain, there could be a positive realignment with Commonwealth countries as well?
I've always thought that the Commonwealth was one of the great underused resources in the world, and that it could have a much more significant role. Long ago, when I was Environment Secretary, together with my Indian opposite number, we convened the first ever meeting of Commonwealth Environment Ministers. And it was a useful exercise. We were just at the beginning. Unfortunately, my successor as Environment Secretary was much more interested in the European Union than in the Commonwealth, and those meetings didn't continue. But I've always thought the Commonwealth could have a significant part to play in the world, and I'd be strongly in favour of any efforts to bring that about. But we shouldn't be starry-eyed about it. Commonwealth countries, even those with whom we have the closest links, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, they all have their own interests. And those interests are not always absolutely identical with ours. And we have to understand and respect that in the new world in which we are entering.
I mean, on that point, just briefly to touch upon, I mean, one of the arguments against renewed ties with the Commonwealth is the fact that Australia, Canada, New Zealand have very much got economically into bed with China. But one wonders after the coronavirus crisis if they would be wary of putting all their eggs in one Sino-centric basket.
Well, they do. Australia, in particular, has very difficult issues to deal with in relation to China. It takes a third of Australia's exports, but Australia is very wary of Chinese influence. And that is something they have to deal with on a daily basis.
I mean, sticking with that idea, Michael, there will be some people listening to us talking who would say, well, you know, the UK moving away from this 500 million strong market on its doorstep, there's no way that links with, a new trade deal with the US or any rejuvenation of ties with the Commonwealth or indeed India or anywhere else, Brazil perhaps, it could never compensate for the losses we're going to see from Brexit. What would you say to that argument?
Well, first of all, that depends on the outcome of our negotiations with the European Union. We don't know, as we sit together today, just on what terms we will continue to have access to the European market. I'm quite certain we will continue to have access to it. It's not the case that access to that market will cease at the end of this year. Of course it won't. It's a question of the terms on which we have access to that market. But even if those terms are not quite as favourable as I would like them to be, although there may be some short-term truth in the point which you've just put to me, I think in the longer term things will even out, and we will continue to trade effectively and fruitfully and profitably, both with the European Union and with the rest of the world.
Talking about the European Union, what's been your sense of what's been going on there? I mean, we've obviously seen this division in the eurozone about the so-called Corona bonds, common debt issuance. This was something that the Italian and Spanish government were pushing for, in the mostly northern European countries. The richer northern European countries like Austria, Germany, and the Netherlands were opposed to it. We've now got news of a new Franco-German proposed 500 billion euro bailout fund for the eurozone. And of course, we've had this German Constitutional Court ruling about ECB bond buying. Putting all of that into context, what are your thoughts about the state of the EU and the eurozone during and after this coronavirus crisis?
Well, this has exposed the fundamental flaw in the whole concept of the euro and the eurozone. I don't think you can have a single currency without a single government. A single currency might work well when you have large-scale transfer payments from those parts of the currency zone that are prosperous to those parts of the currency zone that are much less prosperous. The sort of thing that happens within a country. The eurozone isn't a country. It has a single currency. The single currency is causing immense difficulties for some members of the eurozone. Germany benefits enormously from the fact that it has an undervalued currency. If the Deutschmark were to be brought back, which I'm not suggesting it's likely in the immediate future, its rate of exchange to other currencies would obviously be much higher than the rate of the euro to those other currencies. So Germany in particular is benefiting enormously from the undervalued currency that the euro brings it. Other countries, which in normal times would see their currency dropping because of the difficulties they face in relation to currencies in the rest of the world, are unable to take advantage of that. This is the fundamental flaw of the eurozone. The virus has exposed it in the same way that the financial crisis 10 years ago exposed it. And it seems to me the European Union is no closer to dealing with that fundamental flaw than it ever has been.
Yes, I often characterize the EU as a sort of a union without a demos. There's no sort of unifying, they don't have a unifying people. There's a famous phrase, isn't there? Never let a crisis go to waste. And one wonders if the Euro federalists will argue that, well, you had national politicians that had to answer to national electorates. Wouldn't it be so much better if we had we had common European politicians who have to answer to one common European electorate? Do you think this crisis and what's happened and the division we've just spoken of will be a catalyst for more integration? Perhaps this will be the spur towards federalism.
Well, I'm sure that what you describe as the Euro federalists, I'm sure they'll argue that. Whether they'll succeed remains to be seen. I have my doubts, but that is the fundamental dilemma that faces the European Union and in particular the eurozone.
Do you think there's a threat of sovereign debt crises in the eurozone? I mean, one could look at Italy and Spain right now and say they are almost they are in very, their finances are in a very parlous state. Do you think there is a threat for sovereign debt crises?
Well, there's a danger, but the European Central Bank will be determined to do everything it can to deal with that danger. So I don't foresee any sort of imminent collapse, but there are great challenges which the eurozone faces, and in particular the countries to which you refer.
And presumably, either if the EU and the eurozone went down the route of more federalism, or indeed it went down the route of disintegration, either way, if the UK remained tied to the EU, if the transition period was extended, that would be very dangerous, presumably, for Britain.
Well, yes, it would be. And there are many more specific things than that. For example, if we were to stay in beyond the end of this year, the European Union is going to embark on its next budget discussions early next year. Would we be part of them? Would we be expected to pay into the new budget commitments that will be made at that time? There are lots of really practical problems that would arise were the implementation period to be extended beyond the end of the year.
And one final question, Michael, on the EU. We touched on the German Constitutional Court ruling. Do you think this represents a serious threat? It's a little bit. Someone said to me in another interview, it's almost like a sort of a part of an empire rebelling against that empire, sort of vassal state of an empire rebelling against part of an empire. Do you think this could have real ramifications for the eurozone, or is it something that will be glossed over?
Well, it could constitute a real difficulty, or it could be glossed over. Time will tell. It's difficult to judge at this point.
Now, as you are former Conservative leader, before we close up, just turning back to domestic politics. Obviously, nobody saw this crisis coming, and it has, as for the British government, as with all governments, it has really sort of directed their attention away from their agenda. To what extent do you think this crisis and the lockdown and the economic consequences are going to move the government away from the agenda they had, such as the levelling up agenda? Or can things get back on track fairly soon?
Yes, I think the levelling up agenda will be part of our agenda for recovery. And so I don't see any conflict or inconsistency between the two. I think as the government plays its part in encouraging and engineering an economic recovery, it will want to do so in a way that embraces the levelling up approach. So I don't see any inconsistency there.
And I know you're wary of making any major forecast or prediction, but I always end on this. If you'd humour me, if there is one broad prediction you could make for, it could be the UK, could be Europe, over the next 6 to 9 months, what would that broad prediction be?
The next 6 to 9 months are going to be pretty difficult for all of us. And beyond that, I think it's impossible to foresee.
Okay, well, I think we can end it there. So, Lord Howard, thank you very much for your time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jonathan.
And thank you for watching. You can find out more at www.brexit-watch.org. You can also find us on Facebook and on Twitter. Until next time.